In this chapter, we begin our journey into macroeconomics, and specifically, we start to talk about what macroeconomics does as a field, and then start our discussion with what how we can try to understand what's going on in an overall economy, which means that we're going to focus on individual statistics. And there's really three key statistics that economists focus on, and that would be the gross domestic product, or GDP, which is the focus of this chapter, which is a way of measuring production. And then we will look at unemployment, and then we will look at inflation. Now, see, right there, you're hearing these words and you're thinking, oh, yeah, I've heard that in the news, inflation, unemployment, GDP, and that is a lot of what comes out of economics, is that you hear about it in the news much more so than, for instance, microeconomics. And we're going to understand here how that statistic is calculated, what a good number versus a bad number looks like, and then once we put all those numbers together, what does that really paint for us as a picture of where we're at for the economy? So essentially, what we will be looking at here are statistics that cover some aspect of production, some aspect of employment, and some aspect of prices. Okay. I'm just trying to get this here. Okay, so in the previous chapters, what we were just looking at was economics in general. So as a chapter, those wouldn't have differed very much from what you would have received when you took just a microeconomics course, right? That economics as a discipline focuses on facts, right? So it's a positive science. And, we had a very brief definition that macroeconomics was looking at the economy as a whole, and that the only other part to this was that economics, just as a general field of thought, was that we were looking at scarcity, this ability of people, or this challenge that people face to try to meet all of their needs with limited resources. Okay. Now, what we need to do is we need to translate all that into macroeconomics. So for macroeconomics, one of the things that we start to see is that we can first, again, counter macroeconomics with microeconomics, and then in the rest of this chapter, we start to look at GDP, which is which is our acronym here for gross domestic product, which we'll talk about much more about what that is. But before, rather than just keep talking about GDP and not knowing what GDP stands for, it stands for gross domestic product, which is just another way of saying total production. Okay, so again, to remind us here that this difference of microeconomics versus macroeconomics, if I'm teaching the course, this first third of the course that we just have gone through is exactly the same, right? We talk about supply demand, we talk about elasticity maybe a little bit, we talk about comparative statics, and we talk about international trade with comparative advantage. It's always the same, regardless of the introductory economics course that you take with me. Where microeconomics differs from macroeconomics is that, just so you get a preview, if you've already taken the course, I'll be reminding you of what you did, but if you didn't, in microeconomics, at this point, we start talking about how individual consumers make optimal decisions, and we talk about how firms determine the prices that they charge based on the level and type of competition that they encounter. And that's really the rest of the course. Consumers making optimal decisions, firms making optimal decisions. Maybe you get enough time to talk about game theory, but that's about it. Macroeconomics, well, that's what we're going to be experiencing right now. We're going to spend the next few weeks here talking about these three major economic statistics: GDP, unemployment, and inflation. And then in the last part of this course, what we look at is how do we take those three statistics that paint the picture of where we're at as an economy, and how do we translate that into whether we're doing well or doing poorly, and then what other kinds of changes do we need to make. With those changes being, as we'll see in the last part of this course, being either that we have the central bank get involved and or we have the government get involved to either slow down the economy or, more often than not, stimulate the economy. Okay, so here's our discussion here of what is gross domestic product. It's the way that we measure the total production of everything within the country's border. Okay, so let me rewrite this as I would orally describe it here. Total production within the country's borders, the geographical borders. So total production within the country's border and it's usually during a specific period of time. So we could say, for instance, how much was produced in the United States in 2024, right? So total production in the United States identified as the country that we're worried about, whose borders it is, during 2024, that being the time period. So we can look at this, right? Well, I talk about old data here when I am on so we're going to be using this site quite a bit here. This is called FRED. It's the Federal Reserve Economic Database. We use it as an economist, pretty much use it every day. It compiles all the data, economic data that's captured around the world, but obviously the focus is on the United States. I own a hoodie from Fred. I got it by winning a contest. Yes, I do own. I also own a T-shirt from Fred as well. So look at this. If we look at trending search terms, so we're at fred.stlouisfed.org. One of the trending search term is GDP. I'm just going to click on that here. And I'm just going to click on gross domestic product right here. And we can see all the way back to when it first started to get captured here shortly after World War II, we can see how GDP has grown over the years. With obviously times where it's declining in these gray regions, those are defined as recessions, which we'll talk about a bit more here. But we can see here that as of Q4, so that would mean the last 3 months of 2024, as an economy, we're at about $29 trillion in total production, close to $30 trillion in total production as of December 2024. Okay. Right, that would be the dollar value, so $29 trillion of total production this year as of 2024. Okay. So, and this is the market value. So meaning that we just would imagine, this isn't like the cost of production or anything like that. This is just the total market value. And not only is it the market value, but it's the final goods and services. So it's goods and services, but it's also the final goods and services. This becomes important because we can imagine that with certain things that, so for instance, something like a car or a house, which involves a lot of other things being brought into it, like buying a new car has tires, a tank of gas, and all that stuff. We're not going to count the tires that Toyota buys to put into the car. And the reason why is because that presumably would be counted when the car itself is purchased, when it's sold. If we counted the tires and then counted the car, the tires would be counted twice. So to ease our calculating life, we look at only the final goods and services sold during a particular point in time. Now, it's also true that what is production is also income. Now, why is that the case? Well, the reason why that's the case is remembering back to, what was it, chapter 1, maybe it was chapter 2, where we could talk about there being firms and households. And the idea is that firms pay us wages, right? That's kind of our income. Let's leave it, not make it production, but let's do it like this. Sorry. Okay, so let's just, I was debating about how much to collapse this or how much to simplify this. Okay, so let's just look at this. How do you and I get all of our money, right? Unless you're sitting in this class because you were born rich, but then you probably should have spent more money and taken this class at a fancier university. But for the rest of us, who are rather poor, right, we all work for our money, which would mean that we receive income in the form of wages by selling our labor. Now, what we do, right, is that we then take that money and we buy goods and services. And firms are selling us their production. Well, what you're seeing here is that all these arrows basically have to equal each other because it's all equalizing out, right? What we give to firms comes back to us, right? Minus some, profit levels and whatnot. But essentially what we're seeing here in this slide is that basically the production, the market value of the production that's sold to us by firms to us as consumers would have to also equal the income that we get from firms for selling our labor that we basically give back to them to buy the goods and services that we need to survive. Now, so how are we going to use these numbers? What are we going to do with our calculation of GDP? Well, I've already talked about the third one, and that's for the most part the most important part for me, which is this data combined with other data from inflation and unemployment helps us determine where we are currently at. It's the equivalent of like going to the doctor, and before you tell the doctor, I've got a really big pain or I'm not feeling well, right? What does the doctor do, right? They take your blood pressure, they take your temperature, they take that hammer to your knee and, make you kick it up. Right? They diagnose you. And that's what GDP helps us do. It helps us diagnose where the economy is. GDP can also be used in slightly different ways. It can be used to determine what the overall living standards are in the country. But that's a very broad measure of the living standard. By that I mean, if we were to look at the GDP per person in the United States, if my memory serves me right, it's at about 35,000 some dollars, the highest in the world. But we certainly know that there are people that don't have homes. We certainly know that there are people who work 3 jobs and still live in abject poverty. So it's a very quick but inaccurate measure of overall living standards. And then number 2 is that GDP can also be used to measure economic growth. It turns out that, right, in this case, economies do need to grow, and it's been debated since really the time of Adam Smith with Wealth of Nations. It's been debated for a long time. How do you get economies to grow? Well, you wouldn't know whether it's growing or not unless you knew where we were starting at, what level of production we were starting at, and then what level of production we are at now, and how that change occurred over time. Okay. Okay. When we look at these living standards and we look at how they change over time, one of the things that we see here is that the overall GDP level, unless we do the per capita part, which is what I just had mentioned, unless we're taking it like per capita, the GDP is not going to be adjusted for the population size, and it's just a very broad measure of the overall level. And that additionally, we can see this. Sorry, it's really moving around here. Sorry. But as I said, one of the, what I'd already mentioned, that one of the things that economists do is they find they calculate what's called GDP per capita, which just involves taking the total population and dividing the GDP by that amount. So in essence, we could look at China, which has obviously over 1 billion people, and we could calculate that despite the large GDP for China as a country, it also has a lot of people, which means that the GDP per capita is quite small, $8,000 as of 2016. So that's 8-year-old data. But in Germany, even though it's a smaller GDP, it's also a smaller country in terms of population, which obviously gives us now this kind of rank ordered, this is for 2019, gives us this rank ordered way of thinking of the GDP per capita. 65 to 80, I'm sure that we can get better, more updated data than this. Let's look at this. There's nothing more annoying, my friends, than old data. Yeah, 87,000. I mean, look at that. That's changed quite a bit even since 2019. So if we were to have relied on that data, we'd be sorely outdated. 2024, 87,000. That's a huge jump. I mean, look at this. It helps that some people died during COVID. I'm not laughing at the fact that some people died. It's just a more dismal way of looking at it. GDP per capita could be going up because we have fewer people, not only because people aren't having as many children, but also obviously a lot of people died during COVID. But also the economy did grow quite a bit. So we see a pretty significant change here from 2020, 65,000 to 87,000. I mean, that's what, not quite 50% change, but that's a quite significant change in just a few short years. And then obviously we have these other countries here as well, China, Japan. And we could, if you're curious about what it is and pick your favorite country here, we could look at, you could go to the Fred website and find that data. But we could use this idea of GDP to kind of affirm for ourselves in this ultra-patriotic way, I guess, that the U.S. is the richest country in the world. But again, there's a really big asterisk on that because it's not that we necessarily have, that money is not obviously spread or distributed equally. And then again, we can look at this from a growth perspective, looking at how large the economy has grown. And we would simply look at this in terms of how much that number is changing as a percent over time. Now, you're starting to see a new term here. Real per capita. What we're going to see here is that there's two different ways to calculate GDP. And so essentially we have what's called a nominal GDP and a real GDP, where the nominal GDP would be looking at things in terms of current year prices, and real GDP would be looking at things in terms of a base year price or a constant price. Because there are two ways that GDP can change. And so that's why this third bullet point is here. So if we just calculate market values, what would a market value be? It'd be the price of the good times how many are sold, right? That would give us what the value is, the market value of the good, right? If I sold 100 pencils at $1 a piece, the total market value of those pencils would be $100. But what if just the price doubled to $2? Now the market value would be $200. But when I'm looking at GDP, most of the time I'm just caring about the Qs. And the Qs in this very simple example I gave you didn't change. It was still 100 pencils. But if I looked at this nominal GDP, we would see that the nominal GDP went from 100 to 200. But I would be misled or confused. What I would need to do is calculate something with a base year price. So basically what I would say is I'm going to look at what the market value is in terms of what the prices were in 2024 or 2022. So the price will always be the 2022 price, but I'll let the quantity be whatever it wants to be. So that you kind of see this difference. I'm going to type in real GDP, and I'm going to edit the graph, I'm going to add a line, and I'm going to add a line for nominal GDP. And we're going to see, hopefully, that they're different. Well, yes, they are very different. What you can see here is that I just did percentage changes here, that the percentage change in the nominal GDP is going to be greater than the percentage change in the real GDP. And the reason why is that there's two ways nominal GDP can change. Nominal GDP, I'll write this over here. Nominal GDP can change either when the price changes and or when the quantity changes. So both of them can contribute to that change. Real GDP? It only changes when the quantity changes. And that's the only time that we see that kind of change happening. But what it allows us to do by measuring the nominal GDP and the real GDP is it gives us a way to calculate how prices are changing. And we can do that by calculating what's known as a GDP deflator, where that deflator for, let's say, 2023 would be the nominal GDP for that year divided by the real GDP for that year times 100. That's going to give us a ratio here. In the base year itself, so right, we had to remember with the deflator, we had to pick a base year. In the base year, the numerator and denominator would be the same number. Every other year, though, the numbers will be different, and we could calculate what the deflator is, and then the price change that'll be the percentage change in the GDP deflator. And so that's what we can kind of see here. Again, this is data, at least that takes us out through 2021, but at least we can see here that the nominal GDP is greater than the real GDP, and that the difference between the two is going to be our measurement of inflation between the two. Okay, but look at what we've got here, right? So they have calculated for us what the GDP deflator number is. But now what I can do is if I ask the question, how much did prices change from, let's say, 2010 to 2016? Well, then I would take my number from 2016, 106, minus my number from then, 96 over 96 times 100. Get out my calculator here. That would be about a total change of 9.43% over that entire time period. That's how much prices changed. And obviously we could calculate this for various years. We can, in fact, we can actually look at what the deflator numbers are. Right, we could actually create this as a a table. Or bar chart, yeah, I mean, just these here. But I could get the, I could download this data as a, I think, oh yeah, it'll let me do it from the data from Excel, and I could calculate then the changes over time. Or I could kind of like hover over a number here and kind of get the number this way. Now you'll notice that these numbers are a little bit different than the numbers that I showed you in that chart. It doesn't, that part doesn't matter. The reason why you're seeing different numbers is because I chose the recession of 2020 as my base year for 100. If we go back over here, looks like they use 2012 as their base year. So you'll get a slightly different index number because there's a slightly different point of reference. But the process is still the same. We would, step one, you would calculate the deflator itself, which is our equation right here. If I'm not giving you the deflator number, you would have to calculate it as the ratio of the nominal divided by the real. Then, once you've got all your deflator numbers, you could then take the percentage change in those numbers, in those deflator numbers, to find out the overall change in price. And so that's kind of what we just see right here. We can look at how things are changing in terms of the real GDP, how that real GDP is changing. So we would measure economic growth. The measure of economic growth would be the percentage change in the real GDP. Okay, so, and we obviously already can see this here. Yes, overall, certainly in my entire lifetime, certainly in all of your entire lifetime, overall, the economy has been growing. And we can see this here if we look at real GDP per capita. Real GDP meaning it's just capturing the overall changes. We would see that change over time here. And, this has generally been the case for many countries. India, Mexico, Turkey, Poland. But then there are obviously some exceptions, Liberia being one of them. And so what this kind of does for us, right, is that once we've got the data, we can then use that to have a conversation about how we think things, what things cause that to happen. In the case of Liberia, it's largely caused by political instability and warring factions within the country. Liberia has had a pretty extensive warring parties within the country that basically destabilize it and destroy economic growth. Whereas Poland, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Poland has largely integrated itself into the EU, embraced market capitalism, and has grown dramatically. Right, that would be the narrative, at least, that someone would tell for both of those countries. And so, let me pause here. And so what we do is we use this data about what the GDP level is, to be able to talk about where we're at within the economy, what we would call the business cycle. And that, even before you're hearing this for the first time, you probably are largely familiar with it. Fortunately, we had a very severe, at least fortunately in terms of understanding this example, we had a quite severe, quite abrupt decline in the economy when COVID started, right? And back around the time that many of you were born, there would have been the 2008-2009 financial crisis, where the economy declined. And then we see that the economy then, over time, generally will get better. And then it will decline, and then it will get better, and then it will decline, right? And it will go through this kind of cycle, right? And that this cycle, we can measure it in terms of the expansionary period of that cycle, where we would measure from the lowest point of the economy to the highest point, or we could measure the time period for the contraction, which would be going from the highest point down to the lowest point. And so we kind of see this again. You kind of see this like wave function here, peak to trough, where we would imagine that what's preceding that is the contractionary period, which would be from the peak to the trough, and then the expansionary period from the trough to the peak. But that overall, over the long run, we can see that the economy is steadily rising. This idea of business cycles largely emerges in the late 1920s, early 1930s, when the field of macroeconomics is kind of coming into form. So this would be individuals that you probably do know very well, or at least have heard the name of, like John Maynard Keynes. But then there's other names of economists, one, for instance, that I'm conducting research on right now, like Lachlan Curry, who is largely forgotten in the literature, but was one of the first individuals to really thoroughly talk about business cycles back in the 1920s. But we see this overall growth. And so here you're seeing how much has the GDP, real GDP, grown since the 1970s. So I'm born in 1977 during the recession that just ended at that point, I think. So you see this kind of, just again, general increase. Again, let's not look at old data. Let's look at real GDP in the United States. Go back to this. And let's edit the graph. And let's look here. And I'm going to pick the recession of 1975. And we'll look at it from an annual basis. And there we go. We can see that since 1975, right? So in 1975, it'd be approximately 100, which it is. Since 1975, that the economy has basically almost nearly quadrupled since 1975 in terms of size, right? To go from 100 to 384.5 would give us near quadrupling in the size of the economy. That's a lot of economic growth. But again, you can see that the general trend line is going in an upward direction. But yes, there are cycles. And we see those cycles here in these gray regions, which is our recessions, the shaded regions indicating U.S. recessions. If you're interested in this kind of stuff, in terms of recessions, we have a non-governmental organization in the United States called the National Bureau of Economic Research. And since the 1920s, when it was created, this is the National Bureau of Economic Research is the official committee that determines when a recession exists or doesn't exist. And they've gone back in time to long before they existed. They've gone back to all the way back to 1854. So back when, before Abraham Lincoln was even president. Who would have been president in 1854? Franklin Pierce, I think. Let's see. Boom! 1854. It helps that my middle son's name is Pierce. He was not named after Franklin Pierce. It's a family name. Pierce. So back when the president was Franklin Pierce, Franklin Pierce, I guess, would have had a recession very early on in his presidency. But right, look at this. You can now see, look at this. These words are starting to make some sense to you. Peak to trough, trough to peak, right? And you can get a sense of how long in months, right? Here you had an economy in decline for 18 months, growing for 30 months, making the entire business cycle lasting 48 months. Then here you had an economy right, this would have been right before the Civil War, declining for 8 months and then growing for nearly 2 years, making it a 30-month business cycle. Right, and you kind of just look over time and you can see, now look at what's happening here. You kind of look in these general time periods, look at what's happened here. The business cycle has become longer, and macroeconomists would like to pat themselves on the back and say we're doing a better job at making the contractionary periods shorter and the expansionary periods longer. Okay. So now let's look at a little bit more about what's going on in the GDP in terms of counting why certain things are counted and how they're counted. So GDP in its measurement, why are we counting the market value? Why are we including goods and services? Why is it only final goods? Why within the country? And why is it a particular time period? So let's look at each of these here. Now we've already said much of this, so I might go a little bit more quickly through these slides to not make this video super long. But as I said before, when we're looking at the market value of something, that essentially we're going to take the price and we're going to multiply it by the quantity. So, right, and we would have to do that for each segment, right? So I'd have to do it in this case for corn, and then I'd have to do it for cars, where I'd multiply the price times the quantity, right? And then summing up cars, corn, market values, that'll give me my total nominal GDP. Right? And that's kind of the work that they do here, where I could take the quantity times the unit price to get the market value. But again, this will be a nominal value because I'm just letting the price be whatever it's going to be at that point in time. Because the price can change, and these are the words that are written below the table, because the prices can change, telling someone the nominal GDP isn't always that helpful. Because if the price alone is changing, nominal GDP will go up, but we'll have the mistaken belief that we produced more stuff, when in fact all that happened is that the price changed. And so then when we look at what all changed and what are the things that can be purchased, we'd be talking about goods and services. Goods being just quite simply tangible things, physical things. Looks like that loving couple is buying a washing machine. And that picture looks pretty old because washing machines today look pretty fancy. Hey, that's my dryer, actually. This is my dryer. It's a GE dryer. I know it because I own it. It's a really big dryer. I have a family of 6 and we use this really big dryer. I bet you that's a GE dryer. Interesting. Yeah, my dial is broken and the buzzer no longer works when you push that button. So these people shouldn't be buying it because it looks like I can't tell where they're buying it at. I bought mine at Sears, which doesn't even exist as a store, but that looks like a Sears. Okay. Oh, sorry, I skipped the other part of this. Services are intangible things. We sell in the United States, our GDP consists more of services than of goods. You taking this course right now is education, which is a service. Healthcare, entertainment. Who buys advice? Well, I guess financial services is advice. Travel, banking, all these things are services, which are intangible, but also part of the GDP. And what we can see here is what I just said, which is that services are more than half of the overall GDP in the economy. And that, again, what we have to do is we have to do some backwards calculations here to make sure that we're not double counting things. As in the example I told you, if I counted tires that were sold to Toyota and I also counted the car itself that Toyota built, the problem would be is that those tires would have been counted twice. So I need to deduct what are called these intermediate goods. Now, you can take an approach to understanding this where I look at only intermediate goods. And I could add up intermediate goods where I theoretically, all the components that went into producing a Toyota car should also be reflected in the overall car itself. But most of the time, just to make our life easy, we just look at the overall final good that was produced. All right, and so again, what you should see here is that we can take a value-added approach to get the sum cost of all the materials, right? But if we had counted everything from the final good approach, look at what would have happened, right? It basically would be nearly double. See, because look at what's happening here. 10, right? But now you're adding up the 5 and the 10 to be 15. The 15 and 15 to be 30, the 30 and the 49 to be 79. Okay, so from GDP, what we can also talk about is GNP, Gross National Product. This isn't used very often. What it does is it allows you to look at what is produced by the workers and resources that are owned by the people of that country. So it's more of a citizenship determination, which would mean that, for instance, if I'm working as an American citizen in another country, my work in that other country would count towards the U.S. GNP. And we would see this also for, if we make Nike shoes in Thailand, because it's for a company that's owned in the United States, that would count towards the U.S. GNP. With Thailand's GDP, but obviously not Thailand's GNP, because it's not owned by those in the country. Now, GDP does have a few other issues. Gross domestic product does have a few other issues. We talked about the one where we need to do some steps to avoid double counting from intermediate goods. But also, because we're only focused on a particular time period, sometimes we need to subtract things during 1 year or not count things in 1 year and then go back and count it in the other. So for instance, if the car is produced and sold in 2022, so that would count towards the let's see. Okay, let's make this work here. That would count in the GDP for 2022. Let's say that it was produced in 2022, sold in 2023. Then what you would do is we're going to learn here in a bit that there's a category called inventory, which basically means that it was produced but unsold. So that would count in inventory in 2022. And then in 2023, what would happen is that inventory would go down and consumption would go up by the exact same amount. So from an accounting perspective in 2023, we wouldn't see any change because both of these would go down by this one would go down by the amount that this goes up. All the action would have occurred in 2022 when the item was originally produced. Now, let's say the owner decides to sell it in 2 years later. So in 2024, all that you're going to really see here in that part of the sale would be, I don't know, maybe you'd have some markup by the used car dealer, I don't know, new air freshener, but you're not going to count the, let's say, the $5,000 or $6,000 you pay for that used car. That's not going to be part of this because that's going to all, you don't want to count it again because that $5,000 or $6,000 that exists in 2024, it was originally created back in 2022. So we have 4 categories here. Y equaling CIG NX. And if you're a really curious person and you've managed to listen to a lecture for this long, I have a personalized license plate. And my personalized license plate, actually, I don't think I have a picture of it, but it actually is YIC as CIG NX. That is my personalized license plate. No one else has it. Except my good friend in Wisconsin has the exact same license plate. He and I agreed to get dual license plates. His in the state of Wisconsin, mine in the great state of Hawaii. These are the 4 categories that we have for national income accounting from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. All things that occur in the economy in a given year go into these categories. So we need to talk about these 4. The CIG and NX all total the output, which is also, by default here, also the income. So let's talk about consumption first. Consumption is about 70% of the total GDP. And basically it's services, as we already talked about. It's physical goods with the exception of new housing. New housing we're going to see is counted as an investment. And the goods that are purchased are split into 2 kinds of goods, durable goods and non-durable goods. Durable goods would be like cars, appliances. This would be goods that on average last about 5 years. Non-durable goods would be goods that last for less than 5 years. Why do economists split it up between durable and non-durable goods? Because during a economic trouble times, durable goods, the willingness of someone to buy a durable good usually only occurs when people are feeling optimistic about things. Durable goods are then known to last a pretty long time, and there's not a great deal of variability in the durable goods, only because basically a refrigerator wears out, people replace it only because it is completely broken, and then they just have to replace it, regardless of their income levels. The non-durable goods are much more income sensitive because you would alter your monthly budget on non-durable goods based on how good or how bad things are that particular month. The change that also occurs for durable goods versus non-durable goods would be dependent on whether we are in an economic peak or an economic trough. You might find again that someone at the bottom of an economic trough, like when things are really, really bad, they might just try to buy a used fridge. They're not going to go out and buy a new fridge. Or they'll buy a used vehicle, they won't buy a new vehicle. The non-durable goods, they are more income sensitive with the exception of the essentials, those essentials being food and clothes. So this kind of information would be helpful because you would try to predict the impacts, for instance, of a recession or of an economic boom time based on consumption of these types of goods, durable goods and non-durable goods. We can, so that we have an idea here, let's just type in durable goods United States. Yeah, so this would be about what? A little over $2 trillion. And we could add to this non-durable goods. Not sure why it's showing me this here. I can't delete it. Okay, well, let's do this. Obviously, what we're seeing is that non-durable goods are more than the durable goods. But if we put in the third line here, which would just be consumption, we would see that that's approximating here about 20-some trillion dollars. That would be about 20 of the 30 on average. So that's going to give us this personal consumption expenditures is covering both goods and services. You can see, even if we added these up, that would be what, 4 plus my non-durable My non-durable and my durable would be what, maybe about 6 or 7, and then the remainder, the 13 or so, would all be services, adding up to personal consumption. And that gets us to investment here. Investment is not, I'm going to start off with what it is not. It is not stocks, bonds, anything in the financial markets. That's not an investment. Not in the way that we're talking about here. An investment is basically on buildings, machines, technology. And that would be buildings, machines, technology for businesses, as well as new residential housing. And the most volatile component of investment, which would be the inventory levels in general. So this would be buildings, machines, new housing, technology. Now, technology doesn't mean just like computers and stuff like that. We could be like, an example would be like if I spent money to install an assembly line, that would be a technology for an economist. And then basically the production of things that are unsold, inventory. This is approximately 20% of the overall economy, of the overall GDP. And we can basically see that we could calculate that inventory as that difference between, as the addition of what's actually produced at any point in time, plus all the unsold cars that finally get sold. So here they're just adding up in 2022 what was sold of the 16 plus the additional 4, giving me a total change of, or the additional 4 that were produced but unsold, that would be inventory and investment, giving my total change of 20. If we wanted to go back to our graph here, there we go. So we can see here that as of 2023, consumption is about 18, investment is about 5. Okay, so we've got C and I, and now we need G, which would be government spending. Now, for government spending, this is not transfer payments. So transfer payments are when you get money, that you don't have to spend it on anything. So, like for instance, Social Security, right? Social Security, your old folks get a check every month and they can do whatever they want with it. That is not a government purchase. A government purchase, well, a perfect example would be, this university, right? The government, in this case, the state, spent money to build the building, right? And is paying my salary. That would be the government buying a good or service. And again, it is not paying an old person money so that they can live to see another day. And this is both at the federal level as well as the state and local level. This is also about 15 to 20%. Now, if you've been adding up the numbers so far, it's a little bit over 100%. Which is why, in our case, we have a trade deficit, which is about negative 5%, meaning that we import, meaning buy things from other countries. We buy more things from other countries than we sell to other countries. So if we buy more things than sell things, then we have a trade deficit. And obviously you can go in the reverse, where some countries, Japan, China, have trade surpluses. It's very small. And it's actually not big enough to get worked up about, as long as it's relatively small. And so that's what we see here. So this is the data as of 2021. Hasn't changed that much. These are our approximate. It's changed a bit, but it hasn't changed that much. What the overall breakdown is. You do not need to remember the specific numbers, but just for your own life, you might want to be generally aware about how much of a percent of GDP those things are. So obviously then consumption would be our largest component of the GDP. We again can calculate changes. This formula that they're suggesting here would be that if I want to calculate for percentage change, there's lots of formulas out there, but again, my favorite equation is the classic. You're generally given that some old number is changing to some new number. So for instance, that 100 is becoming 110. So then I would take 110 minus 100 over 100 times 100 to find that there was a 10% change. New minus old over old times 100. And so we could calculate that kind of change here if we had the values for 2018 and 2017 for the GDP to find that amount of change. And that's what they've done right here. And that moreover, that the nominal GDP changes in the nominal GDP are equal to the change in the quantity of production plus the change in the price level. The change in the production levels would be the same as finding the change in the real GDP, which is essentially what we're seeing here. And you can kind of just go on this a little bit more. Now, again, GDP is not a perfect measure. Let me just pause this for a second here. So when we talk about then what GDP, we don't want to get too focused on it because it doesn't do everything for us. What it doesn't do well for us is it doesn't measure things that are happening outside of the market. It doesn't measure things that occur that perhaps are illegal but are still activities being done. It doesn't take into account bad things that happen. It doesn't take into account things like pollution and whatnot, and it doesn't also take into account leisure. So the thing I like to say is that in GDP, outside of imports, there is no such thing as subtraction. And the extreme example I could use in this is that if something bad were to really happen, like I get in a car accident, and let's say someone even dies in the accident, GDP just goes up, right? Because the dead person's probably going to have to go to the hospital, and now we have to have a funeral for them. We're going to have to replace some new cars. GDP is just going to go up. We don't subtract for the fact that someone died. Now, let's say that Breaking Bad style, I quit my job as an economist and I start dealing drugs. Well, I mean, although socially speaking, I'm doing a forbidden activity and I'm acting illegally, yet you can't deny the fact that the person's actually doing work, right? We call it underground economy, and some of these things might be a bit more scandalous than others, but basically all illegal activities are not counted into GDP. So we can even talk about like the one that is talked about a lot today would be personal consumption of marijuana, right? If it becomes legal in a state, then it's part of GDP. If it's not, then it's illegal. It's still federally illegal, so from a federal perspective, it would not be part of the federal GDP, even if it's legal in a state. But again, drinking alcohol is legal. It's been legal since 1933. That would mean since 1933, it's part of GDP. Okay, so what do we mean when we talk about non-market activities? Non-market activities would be, in some sense, it's a little bit gender determined, but it's a lot of things that are happening, activities at home. So, for instance, yesterday I came home from work and my wife, it was like 6 p.m. My wife talked to clients on the phone and I stayed home and helped the kids with their homework. No one paid me for it. That was a non-market activity. Again, underground economy, this would be activities that are not taxed, illegal activities, real things that are happening, but not counted as part of GDP. Just in case, because some people are always interested in this, the underground economy in the United States is about 10%. So about 10% of the GDP does not exist because it's illegal activities. In some other countries, the underground economy is significantly larger, which leads to the GDP being understated by a significant amount. This would be either from illegal activities to just not being a great deal of formal markets. So you could understand that in developing countries, the GDP looks really small, but it doesn't mean that nothing's happening in that country. Lots of things are happening. It's just that it's happening off the books. We, again, do not make adjustments for negative things. So if the environment in this case is hurt as we're producing GDP, we do not subtract. Global warming, climate change, not part of GDP. Well, if anything, the GDP is going up because storms are more significant, fires occurring more frequently, thus increasing the GDP. And then we get to leisure time. Leisure does not add to the GDP. And so those Koreans, they work hard, 46 hours a week, average work week, whereas us lazy Americans barely do 40. And the Japanese are just as lazy. Okay. And so that takes us now kind of to the closing slides here. One of the things that people do, but they shouldn't, is that they count GDP as a way to talk about how happy the people are. And that isn't really the case. I'm not sure you could say that Americans are happier just because our GDP is happier. Now, to some extent, you become a little bit happier or satisfied because you're not worried about where you're going to eat or how you're going to get resources. But some developing countries, like the country of Bhutan, Bhutan didn't like that their GDP was always so low. So they actually created a national happiness product, gross happiness product. So Bhutan Let's just type it in here. The Bhutan GDP is a little under a small state in the United States, 2.8, 2.3, about $3 trillion, meaning that it's pretty poor. But they've created an alternative measure for national happiness. It turns out they're pretty happy. Calculating, they've become happier between 2010 and 2022. So, again, we can kind of calculate this happiness in slightly different ways. Again, I've been to some of the countries on this end of the scale. I've been to Liberia, I've been to Somalia, I've been to Zimbabwe. And most of the people did seem pretty happy. And I've been over here too, and the people seem pretty happy. It's hard to say. I'm not sure what that really would tell us here. Okay. Yeah, I've really got nothing more to say about GDP.